Gunfire tore through the Chicago night as Dominic Russo, the ruthless new head of a notorious mafia family, narrowly escaped a bloody internal purge with a life-threatening wound, only to find himself hiding in the shadows, aiming the cold barrel of his gun directly at Clara in a desperate threat. But instead of fleeing in panic from the dying devil, the resilient nurse simply pushed the muzzle aside, fiercely determined to stop the killer's bleeding bound only by her medical oath, unwittingly planting a seed of deranged obsession deep within the underworld boss's mind. That dark obsession exploded so violently that shortly after, Dominic arrogantly invaded Clara's home, shattering her peaceful life as he completely ignored her bewildered fiancé, Julian, and trampled over the authority of her police captain father with an ironclad declaration that sealed her fate. He was not there to negotiate or ask for permission, but to announce that this woman now belonged to him, and their wedding was an absolute command that could not be defied. The echo of Dominic's command hung in the stifling air of the small living room, a heavy guillotine waiting to drop. For a fraction of a second, total silence reigned over the space. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like deafening hammer strikes. Then, the protective instinct of a veteran police officer shattered the paralysis. Captain Robert Hayes roared, his face flushing red with a mixture of disbelief and pure fury, his hand instinctively flying to the service weapon holstered at his hip. He was a man who had dedicated 30 years of his life to cleaning up the streets, fighting the very rot that this man represented. The sight of the city's most dangerous predator standing arrogantly on his faded rug, invading his safe haven and claiming his only daughter as property, snapped his patience entirely. He drew the gun in a fluid motion, leveling the black metal barrel directly at the chest of the mafia boss. But Robert was dealing with apex predators, not common street thugs. Before his finger could even brush the cold curve of the trigger, shadows violently detached themselves from the corners of the room. Dominic had not come to this house alone. For men, towering and silent as the grave, moved with terrifying, practiced synchronization. One immense guard gripped Robert's wrist with bone-crushing force, twisting the joint sharply until the heavy police pistol clattered uselessly onto the hardwood floor, sliding under the sofa. Another guard kicked the back of the older man's knees, forcing the proud police captain down. In the blink of an eye, the authority of the law was shoved face first against the glass coffee table, a cold silencer pressed firmly against the base of his skull. Clara screamed, darting forward to help her father, but a solid wall of a bodyguard stepped in, blocking her path with a chest like iron. Watching his future father-in-law being violently humiliated and the love of his life being claimed like a piece of stolen territory, Julian snapped. The young violinist, a man whose gentle hands were meant only for creating beautiful music, let out a guttural cry of pure, unadulterated rage. He abandoned all logic, fear, and reason. He lunged at Dominic, his fists flying blindly toward the mob boss's handsome, impassive face. Dominic did not even flinch. He stood perfectly still, his dark, calculating eyes registering the incoming clumsy attack with nothing but bored detachment. As Julian closed the distance, Dominic merely shifted his weight. With a sickeningly fluid and brutal motion, he sidestepped the wild punch and drove his knee upward into Julian's stomach. The air left the musician's lungs in a violent, agonizing rush. Before Julian could even begin to collapse, Dominic grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, pulling him close and delivered a devastating, calculated blow to his jaw. Julian hit the floor hard, blood pooling almost instantly from his split lip, his slender body twitching as he gasped desperately for air. He tried to push himself up, his artistic hands trembling violently against the polished floorboards, but his strength was completely gone. He was outmatched in every conceivable way. Dominic smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit, his breathing steady, entirely unfazed by the sudden burst of violence he had just orchestrated. He stepped over Julian's writhing form as if stepping over a piece of trash and walked slowly, deliberately toward Clara. The air in the room seemed to grow colder with every single step he took. Clara stood frozen in place, her chest heaving with rapid, terrified breaths. She looked at her father, pinned and completely helpless with a lethal weapon to his head, and then at Julian, choking on his own blood on the rug they had chosen together. The cozy, warm home she had known all her life had been instantly transformed into a slaughterhouse waiting to happen. Dominic stopped mere inches from her. His towering frame eclipsed the warm light of the living room lamps. He reached out slowly, his leather-clad fingers gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. She shuddered violently at his touch, her skin crawling, but she did not dare pull away. His dark, consuming gaze locked onto hers, burning with that same deranged, terrifying obsession she had seen in the dark alleyway hours ago. When he finally spoke, his voice was a soft, lethal whisper that carried the absolute weight of a death sentence. "You have precisely two choices, my sweet Clara," Dominic said, his tone entirely devoid of any human emotion. "Choice number 1. You turn around, pack a single bag, and walk out that front door with me right now. You become my wife, you live in my world, and these two men get to wake up tomorrow morning to see the sun." He paused, letting the pad of his thumb slowly trace the trembling line of her jawline, feeling her pulse racing like a trapped bird under his touch. "Choice number 2. You refuse me. You foolishly cling to this pathetic illusion of a normal, quiet life. If you do that, my men will pull their triggers. I will stand here and watch your father's brains paint that floral wallpaper. I will personally break every single delicate finger on your lover's hands before I drag him out and drown him in the lake. I will erase their very existence from the history of Chicago, and then, after all that blood is spilled, I will take you anyway." Clara felt the room violently spinning around her. The metallic scent of fresh blood and suffocating fear clogged her throat. She looked at Robert, who was weakly shaking his head against the glass table, his eyes pleading with her not to give in to a monster. She looked at Julian, who was reaching a desperate, trembling hand toward her ankle, silently begging for her. She was a nurse. Her entire life was dedicated to saving people, to preserving human life at absolutely any cost. Dominic knew exactly what he was doing. He was not just threatening her physically, he was masterfully weaponizing her own morality against her. He had built a golden, blood-soaked cage perfectly designed for her soul, and the only key to save the people she loved was her complete surrender. Tears spilled over her thick eyelashes, tracing hot, painful paths down her pale cheeks. She hated him in that moment with an intensity that threatened to consume her entirely. She hated the dark, arrogant smirk playing on his lips, utterly confident in his absolute, undeniable victory. "Let them go," Clara whispered, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her sacrifice. "Say the exact words," Dominic demanded smoothly, leaning in closer, wanting to hear her verbalize her submission. "I will go with you," she sobbed, closing her eyes tightly to shut out the living nightmare. "Just please, do not hurt them anymore. I will do whatever you want." Dominic smiled, a chilling, triumphant expression that did not reach his cold eyes. He snapped his fingers once. Instantly, the guards released Robert, stepping back into the shadows like obedient phantoms. Dominic offered Clara his arm, a cruel mockery of a gentleman escorting his willing bride. Clara ignored his offered arm. She walked past him, her movements robotic, stiff, and utterly hollow. She did not pack a bag. There was absolutely nothing in this house of warmth and love that belonged in the cold hell she was willingly walking into. She stepped out into the freezing Chicago rain, her thin cardigan offering absolutely no protection against the biting, unforgiving wind. A massive, black-armored vehicle waited at the curb, its powerful engine purring like a caged feast ready to devour her. A guard in a sharp suit opened the heavy, bulletproof door for her. Clara climbed inside, sinking into the dark, cold leather seats. As the heavy door slammed shut, sealing her fate with a terrifying finality, she looked out the darkly tinted window one last time. Through the pouring rain, she saw her father and Julian standing in the doorway, broken, bleeding, and entirely powerless, watching as the underworld swallowed her whole. The heavy armored vehicle did not take Clara to a dungeon. It took her to a private, heavily guarded cathedral on the outskirts of the city. The speed at which Dominic Russo operated was terrifying. In the span of a few short hours, the mafia boss had orchestrated an opulent underworld wedding. Clara was led into a lavish dressing room by silent maids who stripped off her damp clothes and encased her in a breathtaking gown of imported white silk and intricate lace. It was a masterpiece that cost thousands of dollars, yet to Clara, it felt no different than a death shroud. A makeup artist expertly concealed her pale skin that was stained with tears, painting a flawless mask over her utter despair. When the heavy mahogany doors of the sanctuary finally swung open, the sight was suffocating. The pews were filled with the most dangerous men in Chicago. Men in sharp suits with cold eyes turned to watch their new queen walk down the aisle. The altar was drowning in thousands of white roses, their sweet fragrance sickeningly thick in the closed air. At the end of the aisle stood Dominic. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, looking like a dark god waiting to claim his sacrifice. Clara did not walk with the grace of a bride. Her steps were mechanical and stiff. She reached the altar, her face devoid of any emotion, her eyes completely vacant. The priest, a man whose hands trembled slightly under the intense gaze of the mafia boss, rushed through the sacred vows. When it was time to sign the marriage certificate, Dominic placed the golden pen into her cold hand. He leaned in, his chest brushing against her shoulder. His presence was an overwhelming weight. Clara stared at the document that would legally bind her to a monster. She thought of her father bleeding on the living room floor and Julian choking on his own blood. With a completely numb heart, she pressed the pen to the parchment and signed her soul away. Dominic took her hand, sliding a massive diamond ring onto her slender finger. The icy stone felt like a shackle snapping shut. He lifted her veil, his eyes roaming her flawless, frozen features. He leaned in to claim his kiss, sealing the unholy pact. His lips were surprisingly warm, demanding and possessive, but Clara stood as rigid as a marble statue. She offered absolutely no response, keeping her eyes wide open, staring right through him with a chilling, hollow hatred. For a fleeting second, a shadow of irritation flickered across the confident face of Dominic. He possessed her entirely, yet the undeniable defiance in her deadened gaze made him feel strangely empty. The reception was a blur of expensive champagne and terrifying congratulations from crime lords. Clara sat beside her new husband at the head table, a beautiful, silent ghost. She did not eat a single bite. She did not speak a single word. Midnight brought the true nightmare. The convoy arrived at the sprawling Russo estate, a colossal fortress of stone and glass hidden behind high iron gates. Clara was escorted to the master suite, a room larger than her entire apartment, decorated in dark velvet and cold marble. The door clicked shut, leaving her completely alone with the man who had destroyed her life. Dominic shrugged off his tuxedo jacket, tossing it onto a velvet chair. He loosened his silk tie, his dark eyes fixed on her. Clara stood frozen in the center of the room, her hands clutching the luxurious fabric of her wedding gown. She was waiting for the inevitable assault. He stepped closer, the predatory grace in his movements making her breath hitch. He reached out, his large hands gripping her delicate shoulders. His touch burned through the silk. He expected her to fight, to scream, to cry, to provide him with the thrill of breaking her resistance. Instead, Clara did the one thing he did not anticipate. She reached up with trembling, icy fingers and slowly began to unbutton the back of her own dress. Her movements were robotic, completely devoid of passion or fear. She let the heavy silk pull at her feet, standing before him in nothing but delicate lingerie. She lay back onto the massive bed, closing her eyes, her body stiff and completely unresponsive. She looked like a sacrificial lamb perfectly resigned to the slaughter. "Do what you have to do," Clara whispered into the silent room, her voice carrying a venomous, quiet contempt that cut deeper than any knife. "My body is part of the deal. Take it and get it over with. But you will never have me." Dominic froze, his hands, hovering over her pale skin, clenched into tight fists. The absolute, degrading submission in her posture was a violent slap to his ego. He was a king who commanded loyalty, fear, and desire. He took what he wanted. But looking down at the woman he had torn the city apart to possess, he realized that forcing himself upon a lifeless, hateful shell would not give him the twisted satisfaction he craved. It made him feel like the very monster she saw him as. A dark, violent frustration surged through his veins. He abruptly backed away from the bed, his chest heaving as if he had just been physically struck. "Put your clothes on," Dominic growled, his voice a dangerous, vibrating rumble in the quiet room. Clara opened her eyes, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through her stoic mask. Dominic turned his back on her, striding toward the heavy oak door. He paused with his hand on the brass handle, looking at her over his shoulder. The obsession in his dark eyes burned hotter than ever, mixed with a newly ignited challenge. "I do not share my bed with corpses," Dominic stated coldly, his jaw ticking with suppressed anger. "You think your silence is a weapon, Clara, but you are in my world now. Keep your pathetic defiance for now, because I swear to you, the day will come when you will willingly walk to me. You will drop to your knees, and you will beg me to love you." He stepped out into the hallway and slammed the heavy door shut, the resounding crack echoing through the empty mansion like a gunshot, leaving the terrified, victorious bride shivering alone in the dark. Outside the suffocating walls of the Russo estate, a different kind of madness was brewing. Julian Vance sat in the center of his dimly lit apartment, surrounded by shattered glass and torn sheet music. His beloved violin, an instrument that usually brought him immense peace, lay neglected in its velvet case. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara being swallowed by the tinted windows of that armored beast. He saw the cold, mocking smirk on the face of the monster who had stolen his future. Captain Robert Hayes had visited him twice, his voice heavy with grief and a stern warning. The veteran policeman had explicitly ordered Julian to stay away, explaining that moving against Dominic Russo required tactical precision and federal backing, not the reckless anger of a broken-hearted musician. But Julian could not listen. His pride was bleeding just as heavily as his heart. He convinced himself that Clara was waiting for a savior, that true love could somehow conquer the heavily armed fortress of the Chicago underworld. Driven by a toxic mixture of desperation and naive heroism, Julian purchased an untraceable, cheap handgun from a street dealer. 3 nights after the wedding, a thick, suffocating fog rolled off Lake Michigan, blanketing the massive shipping containers at the Russo family docks. Julian slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, his hands trembling violently as he gripped the cold metal of the gun. He thought he was moving like a shadow. In reality, he had been tracked by thermal cameras the second his boots touched the gravel. He barely made it 30 yards before reality crashed down upon him. A massive spotlight snapped on, blinding him completely. Before Julian could even raise his weapon, a heavy blow struck the back of his knees. He hit the wet concrete hard. A combat boot stepped heavily onto his wrist, forcing a pathetic cry from his throat as the cheap gun was kicked away into the dark water. The guards did not even bother to speak. They simply dragged him by his collar, tossing him into the back of a black van. Miles away, inside the silent, oppressive walls of the Russo mansion, Clara sat frozen by the massive arched window of her bedroom. She had barely slept or eaten since the wedding night, existing only as a hollow shell. The sudden, sharp knock on her door made her flinch. A stern maid entered, announcing that Mr. Russo required her presence in the underground garage immediately. A cold dread pulled in her stomach as she followed the maid down the winding marble staircases. The air grew damp and tasted of motor oil and concrete as they descended. When the heavy steel doors opened, the harsh fluorescent lights stung her eyes. Clara stopped dead in her tracks, a strangled gasp escaping her pale lips. Kneeling on the hard concrete floor, his face bruised and bleeding, was Julian. Two massive enforcers held him securely in place. Standing a few feet away, looking as immaculate and unbothered as ever in a dark tailored suit, was Dominic. He was slowly twisting a silver ring on his finger, his dark eyes shifting from the broken man on the floor to his terrified wife. Julian looked up, his swollen eyes widening at the sight of her. He fought against the guards, a desperate, gargling sound tearing from his throat. He screamed her name, begging her to run, completely oblivious to the pathetic futility of his situation. Clara tried to sprint toward him, but Dominic stepped into her path, his large hand wrapping around her upper arm with an inescapable, bruising grip. He pulled her flush against his solid chest, forcing her to stay completely still. Dominic leaned his head close to her ear, his breath hot against her freezing skin. His voice was a calm, lethal murmur that echoed terrifyingly in the cavernous room. "I warned you, Clara. I told you exactly what would happen if the people in your past refused to accept the new reality," Dominic said, his grip tightening as she struggled weakly against him. "Your romantic fool of a lover decided to sneak into my territory with a loaded weapon. In my world, the penalty for an attempted assassination is a slow, agonizing death." Clara began to violently shake, hot tears spilling down her cheeks. She turned her face toward Dominic, begging him, pleading with him to show mercy. She promised to be compliant, promised to never speak a word of defiance again if he would just let Julian walk away. Dominic stared down at her tear-stained face, his expression hardening. Her begging only fueled the dark, possessive rage burning inside him. She was crying for another man. She was willing to surrender her pride not for him, but to save a pathetic boy who could not even protect himself. "He lives because I choose to let him live," Dominic declared coldly, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "But every action requires a consequence. He needs a permanent reminder that reaching for things that belong to Dominic Russo comes with an unbearable price." Dominic gave a subtle, sharp nod to the enforcer standing on Julian's right side. The man pulled a heavy, solid steel baton from his belt. The realization of what was about to happen hit Clara like a physical blow. Julian was a violinist. His hands were his entire life, his career, his very identity. She screamed, thrashing violently against Dominic, scratching at his hands to break free. But Dominic was an immovable stone wall. He wrapped his other arm tightly around her waist, pinning her arms to her sides, and forced her chin forward so she could not look away. The enforcer forced Julian's arms out, pressing his delicate, artistic hands flat against the cold, unforgiving concrete. Julian thrashed and screamed, pure terror finally replacing his foolish bravery. The steel baton swung down with a sickening, heavy thud. The sound of bones shattering echoed sharply in the large space. Julian let out a blood-curdling shriek, a sound of absolute, unimaginable agony that would haunt Clara for the rest of her life. He collapsed violently forward, vomiting blood and bile onto the floor as his mangled fingers twitched in unnatural directions. Clara stopped fighting. Her legs gave out completely. If Dominic had not been holding her tightly, she would have collapsed into a lifeless heap. The air left her lungs, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing horror. The world tilted and blurred as she stared at the ruined, bloody hands of the man she had once promised to marry. Dominic slowly released her, letting her fall heavily onto her knees on the cold floor. He looked down at her broken form, then over to the unconscious, bleeding artist. "Drag him out and dump him on the steps of the city hospital," Dominic ordered his men, his voice completely devoid of any remorse. He turned his chilling gaze back to his wife, who was staring blankly at the blood pooling on the concrete. "Let this be the final lesson, Clara. The past is dead, and I am the only future you have left." The traumatic echo of shattering bones did not leave Clara when she was carried back to her luxurious prison. It played on a continuous loop in her mind, a gruesome soundtrack to her waking nightmares. For 7 consecutive days and nights, Clara did not speak a single syllable. She curled into a tight ball in the very center of the massive bed, her eyes fixed blankly on the silk wallpaper. She refused the lavish meals brought to her room by terrified maids. Prime rib, delicate pastries, and fresh fruits were all left to turn cold and rot. She refused even a single drop of water. She was intentionally starving herself to death. It was the only weapon she had left in a world where her autonomy had been violently stripped away. If Dominic Russo wanted to own her, he would only inherit a beautifully dressed corpse. At first, Dominic treated her deterioration with cold authority. He commanded her to eat. He stood over the bed, his voice echoing with dangerous promises of further retribution if she continued this silent rebellion. But Clara simply stared right through him, her hollow eyes completely devoid of the fear that usually fed his ego. To a woman who had already accepted the embrace of death, the threats of a mafia boss were utterly meaningless. By the morning of the 8th day, the situation turned critical. The private physician of the Russo estate examined the limp, pale body of Clara and delivered a grim verdict to Dominic. Her organs were beginning to shut down. If she did not receive nourishment within 24 hours, the damage would be entirely irreversible. The news hit Dominic like a physical blow. The absolute monarch of the Chicago underworld, a man who controlled politicians and destroyed cartels with a snap of his fingers, found himself completely powerless. His vast wealth and terrifying reputation could not force a dying woman to swallow a piece of bread. He stormed into his private study, a blinding wave of dark, uncontrollable panic washing over him. He grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from his desk and hurled it against the stone fireplace. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, but the violent destruction offered no relief. He tore the heavy velvet curtains from the windows and kicked a solid oak chair until the wood splintered. He was terrified. For the first time in his ruthless, blood-soaked life, Dominic Russo experienced pure, agonizing terror. The realization crashed down upon him that his brutal methods of possession were systematically murdering the only light he had ever wanted to keep. That evening, the heavy oak door to the master bedroom slowly clicked open. Dominic stepped inside, dismissing the nervous maids with a sharp gesture. He was not wearing his usual immaculate suit jacket, and his silk tie was discarded. He carried a small porcelain bowl of warm broth and a silver spoon. He walked over to the bed and sat cautiously on the edge. Clara lay incredibly still, her skin translucent, her breathing terrifyingly shallow. She looked like a fragile porcelain doll on the verge of turning to dust. The hands of Dominic, hands that had ended countless lives without a second thought, were visibly trembling as he held the bowl. "Clara," he whispered, his voice cracking, completely stripped of its usual commanding arrogance. She did not move. Her thick eyelashes fluttered weakly, but she refused to look at him. "I brought the finest orthopedic surgeon from Europe to Chicago this morning," Dominic continued, his tone urgent and painfully raw. "He is operating on Julian right now. He will rebuild his hands. I am funding the entire recovery, every single penny." The chest of Clara hitched slightly. A tiny flicker of life sparked in her dull eyes. "And your father," Dominic said, leaning closer, desperately needing her to hear him. "I swear on my life, I swear on the blood of my family, that no one from my organization will ever touch a single hair on his head. They are safe. Both of them. You have my absolute word, and my word is the only unbreakable law in this city." He dipped the silver spoon into the warm broth, bringing it close to her pale, dry lips. He was no longer a king demanding submission. He was a broken man pleading for a miracle. "Just take one bite," Dominic begged, the vulnerability in his dark eyes raw and completely exposed. "One bite, Clara. Please do not let my darkness extinguish your light." The silence in the room stretched into eternity. Clara slowly turned her head. She looked deeply into the eyes of the monster who had kidnapped her, terrorized her family, and broken her lover. But in that specific moment, she did not see a ruthless mafia boss. She saw a terrified, desperate soul kneeling at the altar of his own destructive obsession, begging for salvation. With agonizing slowness, Clara parted her dry lips. She leaned forward just a fraction of an inch and allowed him to feed her the warm liquid. It was a minuscule amount of food, but as she swallowed, Dominic closed his eyes, releasing a long, shuddering breath of profound relief. The unyielding god of the underworld had been brought entirely to his knees, and the first fragile compromise had been sealed in the quiet darkness of her gilded cage. The fragile compromise forged in the dim light of the master bedroom marked a shift in the suffocating atmosphere of the Russo estate. Over the next 3 weeks, Clara slowly regained her physical strength. The finest private chefs prepared nutrient-rich meals, and a discreet doctor monitored her vitals daily. True to his word, Dominic kept his distance. He did not force his presence upon her, often returning to the mansion long after midnight and sleeping in a separate wing of the massive house. He provided her with updates on the recovery of Julian through manila folders left on her mahogany vanity. The European surgeon had successfully reconstructed the shattered bones, though the path to playing the violin again would take years of agonizing physical therapy. Her father, Robert, was safe, reinstated at the precinct, heavily guarded by invisible shadows Dominic had deployed. Clara was physically healing, but her mind was a chaotic battlefield. She hated Dominic for the brutal violence he had inflicted on the men she loved, yet the memory of the terrifying mafia boss begging her to eat on his knees constantly haunted her quiet hours. On a restless Tuesday night, a suffocating bout of insomnia drove Clara from her bed. The mansion was tomb silent, wrapped in the heavy darkness of 2 o'clock in the morning. Wearing a thick cashmere robe over her silk nightgown, she wandered the cavernous hallways. She did not know what she was looking for, perhaps an unlocked door, perhaps a forgotten phone. As she passed the grand foyer, a faint, rhythmic thud echoed from the eastern corridor, a section of the house strictly off limits to the staff. Drawn by a morbid curiosity, Clara followed the sound. It led her to a heavy wrought iron door that had been left slightly ajar. A cold, damp draft drifted up from the stone staircase, descending into the subterranean levels of the estate. The thudding grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wet, heavy impacts and muffled groans. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at her to run back to the safety of her room, but her feet moved forward on their own accord. She crept down the spiraling stone steps, holding her breath, pressing her back against the cold, damp wall. The staircase opened into a massive, dimly lit underground chamber that smelled sharply of copper and stale sweat. Hiding behind a stack of wooden wine crates, Clara peered into the center of the room. What she saw made her blood run cold. Dominic stood in the center of the concrete floor. His immaculate suit jacket was gone. The sleeves of his crisp white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, the expensive fabric splattered with stark red droplets. 2 of his massive enforcers were holding a bloodied, swollen man on his knees. Clara recognized the kneeling man. It was Vincenzo, one of the highest-ranking lieutenants in the Russo family, a man who had smirked at her during the wedding reception. Dominic drew his fist back and delivered a punishing, merciless blow to the face of Vincenzo. The sickening crunch of cartilage echoed in the vault. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, a wave of profound nausea washing over her. She had been foolish to think his moment of vulnerability in her bedroom had changed him. He was exactly what she had always known him to be, a bloodthirsty monster who rolled through violence and terror. She was about to turn and flee when the voice of Dominic cut through the heavy air, echoing with a lethal, vibrating fury she had never heard before. "I gave you exactly one roll when I handed you the South Side territory," Dominic snarled, his chest heaving as he grabbed the battered lieutenant by his blood-soaked hair, forcing him to look up. "One absolute roll, Vincenzo. You run the gambling rings. You run the protection rackets. But you never, ever touch the skulls." Vincenzo spat a mouthful of blood onto the concrete, his voice a pathetic, gurgling plea. "Boss, it was just a small batch. The profit margins on the fentanyl were too high to ignore. The buyers came to us. I did not force them. You sold poison 2 blocks from a public elementary school," Dominic roared, his voice thunderous, completely devoid of his usual icy calm. "You put that garbage into the hands of teenagers. You brought the heat of the federal agents onto my streets, and you endangered innocent children in my city. It is just business, Dominic," Vincenzo gasped. The eyes of Dominic turned pitch black, entirely devoid of mercy. "Not my business. I do not build my empire on the corpses of children." He stepped back, wiping a smear of blood from his knuckles with a pristine white handkerchief. He looked at the 2 enforcers holding the broken man. "Take him to the harbor," Dominic ordered softly, the death sentence hanging heavily in the chilling air. "Make sure he never sets foot in Chicago again. And burn the entire warehouse where he stored the drugs. Every single ounce." Clara stood frozen behind the wooden crates, her breath caught perfectly still in her lungs. The absolute conviction in his voice rang in her ears. He was executing his own high-ranking man, not for a betrayal of money or power, but for crossing a moral boundary that he fiercely protected. As the enforcers dragged the sobbing lieutenant out of the chamber, Dominic stood alone under the flickering fluorescent light. He leaned heavily against a concrete pillar, resting his forehead against the cold stone, looking utterly exhausted. In that solitary moment, he did not look like a demon. He looked like a man carrying the unbearable, bloody weight of a corrupted world on his shoulders, fighting to maintain his own twisted version of justice. Clara carefully backed away, retreating silently up the stone stairs. When she finally reached the safety of her bedroom, she collapsed against the heavy oak door. Her hands were shaking violently. The neat, black and white world she had always believed in was beginning to fracture. The police force her father served was riddled with corrupt officers who looked the other way, yet the terrifying mafia boss who had kidnapped her was violently executing his own men to keep poison away from children. Clara crawled into her massive bed, pulling the silk sheets up to her chin. The image of the bloody, exhausted face of Dominic refused to leave her mind. For the very first time since she had been forced into this gilded cage, the thick, impenetrable wall of hatred inside her heart cracked, letting in a confusing, terrifying sliver of profound understanding. The silver surgical pins holding Julie and Vance together felt like splinters of ice buried deep within his flesh. He sat in the suffocating darkness of a cheap motel room on the South Side, staring at his heavily bandaged hands. The European surgeon Dominic Russo had paid for was a master of his craft, weaving shattered bone and torn tendon back into a semblance of human anatomy. But the hands that rested on Julian's lap were dead things. They were stiff, scarred claws that trembled violently with every single heartbeat. He reached out to grasp the wooden neck of his violin resting on the dirty mattress. His twisted fingers could not even close around the familiar curve. The instrument slipped, crashing onto the stained carpet with a hollow, pathetic thud. That sound was the final nail in the coffin of his sanity. Julian dropped to his knees, not to weep, but to choke on a poisonous, suffocating rage. For 3 agonizing weeks, he had clung to the romantic delusion that he was the tragic hero, the brave lover who had fought a dragon and lost. He had believed Clara was a weeping captive waiting for his triumphant return. But the poison of isolation and chronic physical pain had severely warped his mind. His feverish gaze drifted to a crumpled newspaper clipping tossed in the corner of the room. It was a blurry paparazzi photograph of Dominic Russo exiting a charity gala and walking half a step behind him, cloaked in a designer coat that cost more than Julian would make in a lifetime, was Clara. Julian picked up the clipping, his mangled thumb smearing the black ink. She did not look like a prisoner to his broken mind. She looked immaculate, completely untouched by the grime and blood that had entirely ruined his life. The sick, twisted logic of a broken man began to violently rewrite history. She had not sacrificed herself to save his life. She had traded him. She had looked at the immense wealth, the terrifying power of the Russo Empire, and she had chosen the monster over the struggling artist. She had sold his delicate hands for a heavy diamond crown. The realization did not break his heart. It mutated his love into a grotesque, venomous hatred. He realized that goodness, mercy, and the law his future father-in-law blindly served were nothing but pathetic fairy tales designed to keep the weak exactly where they belonged. To defeat the devil, one had to willingly step into the fires of hell. Julian walked over to the cracked bathroom mirror. The face staring back at him was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that burned with a feverish, unnatural light. The gentle, aspiring musician was dead. In his place stood a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. Dominic Russo had meticulously planned to break Julian's spirit, but the mafia boss had miscalculated a crucial variable. By stripping away his music, his bride, and his future, Dominic had completely unchained a psychopath. Julian smiled at his reflection, a terrifying, crooked expression that did not reach his dead eyes. Dominic had made one fatal error in his arrogant display of mercy. He had flooded Julian's bank account with millions of dollars under the guise of an anonymous medical grant, a pathetic attempt to wash his blood-stained conscience. Julian did not return the money. He weaponized it. He spent the last 14 days slipping into the darkest, most dangerous corners of the Chicago underworld. He sought out the men who hated Dominic Russo as much as he did. He sought out the Falcone Syndicate. The underground parking garage in Little Italy was freezing and smelled of exhaust fumes and rotting trash. Julian stood perfectly still as a sleek black sedan pulled to a stop. 3 heavily armed men stepped out, followed by Don Lorenzo Falcone, an aging, ruthless mob boss whose territory had been systematically suffocated by the aggressive Russo expansion. Lorenzo looked at the trembling, scarred man before him with a mixture of dark amusement and deep suspicion. He had heard the street rumors of the broken violinist, but he did not expect to find a ravenous wolf hiding inside the skin of a slaughtered sheep. Julian did not cower under the intense scrutiny. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his heavy coat and tossed it onto the hood of the sedan. Inside were highly classified architectural blueprints, guard rotation schedules, and digital access codes. Julian had used his vast new wealth to bribe a disgraced, heavily indebted security technician recently fired from the Russo estate. He had mapped the precise blind spots of the golden cage where Clara slept. More importantly, he knew the exact route Dominic took when he visited his illegal harbor shipments during the late hours without his full security detail. Lorenzo picked up the documents, his ancient eyes narrowing as he calculated the lethal value of the stolen information. He looked back at Julian, asking the broken artist what he wanted in return for handing him the head of the Russo Empire on a silver platter. He expected Julian to ask for a massive cut of the territory, or perhaps a fortune in unmarked bills to start a new life. Julian stepped closer to the Mafia Don, his voice a calm, chilling whisper that made even the hardened killers around him uneasy. He did not want a single penny. He did not want a seat at the table. He told Lorenzo that when the massive ambush happened, when Dominic Russo was finally drowning in his own blood on the cold concrete, he wanted the absolute privilege of delivering the final bullet. And as for the beautiful wife of the boss, the woman who had betrayed him to sleep in a bed of silk and blood, Julian had a special, terrifying request. He wanted her delivered to him alive and unharmed. He wanted to watch the realization dawn in her beautiful eyes that her untouchable gilded cage had become a slaughterhouse, and he wanted her to beg on her knees for the life she had so easily thrown away. The dark deal was struck in the shadows, and a deadly countdown to absolute carnage began. The air inside the armored limousine was thick with an unspoken, heavy tension. Clara sat rigidly against the luxurious leather seat, her eyes fixed on the blur of city lights outside the rain-slicked window. They were returning from a high-society charity gala, a suffocating event where she had been paraded as the beautiful, untouchable queen of the Russo Empire. Dominic sat opposite her, his tie loosened, watching her with that intense, dark gravity that always made her pulse race. The fragile truce they had built over the past weeks was a delicate thread, constantly stretched by the overwhelming reality of their world. Neither of them knew that the thread was about to be violently severed. The intelligence Julian Vance had sold to the Falcone Syndicate was flawlessly accurate. As the limousine turned onto a secluded, dimly lit avenue near the edge of the financial district, the trap was sprung. Two heavy, unmarked utility vehicles surged from a blind alleyway, violently ramming the front and rear of the Russo car. The deafening screech of twisting metal was instantly drowned out by the terrifying roar of automatic gunfire. "Get down!" Dominic roared, his voice tearing through the chaos. He did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. Before Clara could even process the flashes of muzzle fire illuminating the dark street, Dominic threw his massive frame across the space between them. He tackled her to the floorboards, pinning her beneath him, using his own body as a living, breathing shield. The bulletproof glass of the limousine was military-grade, but the Falcone ambushers were using armor-piercing rounds. The reinforced window spiderwebbed, then shattered inward with an explosive crack. A torrential rain of razor-sharp glass rained down upon them. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, screaming as the deafening noise assaulted her ears. She felt the heavy, solid weight of Dominic flinch violently above her. A sharp hiss of pain escaped his clenched teeth, but his grip on her only tightened, burying her face into his chest to protect her eyes. Up front, the loyal Russo driver, bleeding heavily from a shoulder wound, slammed his foot onto the accelerator. With a desperate, roaring surge of the massive engine, the armored limousine rammed through the blockade, scraping past the Falcone vehicles in a shower of sparks and fleeing into the labyrinth of the Chicago night. They did not return to the sprawling, heavily guarded estate. The protocol for a direct assassination attempt dictated absolute secrecy. The crippled limousine limped into the forgotten, crumbling industrial district on the outskirts of the city, finally coming to a halt inside a rusted, abandoned parking garage. Dominic kicked the damaged door open and pulled Clara out into the freezing night air. His breathing was ragged, his tailored tuxedo jacket shredded and soaked in a dark, terrifying crimson. He led her up 3 flights of concrete stairs to a nondescript steel door, punching in a keypad code with trembling, bloody fingers. The safe house was a stark, cramped apartment, utterly devoid of the lavish luxury Clara had grown accustomed to. A single bare bulb flickered violently overhead, casting long, harsh shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The moment the heavy deadbolt slid into place, the adrenaline that had been keeping Dominic upright vanished. He stumbled forward, his knees buckling, and collapsed heavily onto a worn canvas sofa. Clara froze, her chest heaving with sheer terror. But as she looked at the absolute ruler of the underworld bleeding out on a cheap couch, the traumatized captive vanished, and the dedicated emergency room nurse took over. "Where are the medical supplies?" she demanded, her voice shaking but laced with sudden, sharp authority. Dominic weakly pointed toward a metal cabinet in the small kitchen area. Clara rushed over, tearing the doors open to find a fully stocked trauma kit. She brought it to the sofa, dropping to her knees beside him. She used a pair of heavy shears to cut away his ruined jacket and the blood-soaked silk shirt beneath. Her breath hitched at the sight of his torso. The right side of his ribcage was a mass of deep lacerations from the flying glass, and a bullet had brutally grazed his waist, carving a dark, bleeding trench through his flesh. If the angle had been a single inch to the left, it would have shattered his spine. "This is going to burn," Clara whispered, uncapping a bottle of industrial antiseptic. Dominic did not look at the wound. His dark, feverish eyes were locked entirely on her face. "Do it," he rasped. As she cleaned the torn flesh, picking up the shards of glass with surgical precision, Dominic did not scream. He only gripped the armrest of the sofa until his knuckles turned completely white. The silence in the cramped room was thick, broken only by his harsh breathing and the metallic clinking of the medical tools. "Why did you do that?" Clara asked, her voice cracking as she tightly wrapped a thick white bandage around his waist. "You could have been killed. You threw yourself over me without even thinking." Dominic let his head fall back against the sofa, his eyes sliding shut. The blood loss had completely stripped away the terrifying, arrogant mask of the Mafia Don. For the very first time, the man lying before her looked incredibly young, incredibly tired, and profoundly broken. "Because my life has absolutely no value without you in it," Dominic answered, his voice a raw, bleeding whisper in the quiet room. "I was raised in a slaughterhouse, Clara. My father put a gun in my hand when I was 10 years old and told me that love was a weakness that would get me killed. I spent my entire life building an empire of fear, swimming in an ocean of blood just to survive another day." He slowly opened his eyes, looking at her with a vulnerability that shattered the last remaining walls around her heart. "And then I looked up in that alleyway, bleeding to death, and I saw you," he continued, reaching out a trembling hand to gently touch her pale, tear-stained cheek. "You were the very first pure thing I had ever seen. You looked at a monster, and you chose to heal him. I did not take you to punish you. I took you because the darkness inside my head was screaming, and your light was the only thing that made it stop. I was drowning, and you are the air." A hot tear slipped down the cheek of Clara, falling onto his bruised knuckles. The horrifying image of Vincenzo being beaten in the basement, the terrifying memory of her forced wedding, everything blurred against the tragic, agonizing truth of the man sitting before her. He was not a demon born of pure malice. He was a deeply traumatized child trapped inside the body of a ruthless king, desperately clinging to her because she represented the humanity he had been violently denied. Clara did not pull away from his touch. Instead, she leaned her face into the palm of his rough, calloused hand, closing her eyes as a profound, overwhelming empathy completely consumed the hatred she had carried for so long. In the dim, flickering light of the safe house, the golden cage finally dissolved, leaving only two broken souls seeking refuge in the darkest night of their lives. The dawn following the ambush brought a deceptive stillness to the city of Chicago. While Dominic Russo rested in the hidden safe house, nursing his severe gunshot wound under the vigilant care of Clara, another dark storm was violently gathering force. Captain Robert Hayes had not slept for a single second. Seated in his dimly lit precinct office, the veteran detective pored over the scattered police reports of the street shootout. His sharp instincts told him the Falcone Syndicate was far too weak to execute such a flawless ambush without highly classified inside intelligence. Operating completely off the grid to protect his daughter, Robert accessed heavily restricted financial records. What he discovered made his blood run completely cold. A massive, untraceable wire transfer had bounced through 3 offshore accounts before landing directly in the hands of a corrupt Russo security technician. But the origin of the money was not a rival mafia don. The digital trail led straight back to Julian Vance. Disbelief warred with a sickening dread inside the chest of the aging police captain. He refused to believe the gentle violinist he had once welcomed into his warm home was capable of orchestrating a massive bloodbath. Armed with his heavy service weapon and a grieving heart, Robert tracked the digital footprint to an abandoned warehouse district on the desolate south side. He arrived under the cover of heavy, gray storm clouds. Stepping into the cavernous, rotting building that smelled of salt and decay, Robert called out the name of his former future son-in-law. Julian emerged slowly from the deep shadows. He did not look like a tragic victim anymore. His posture was rigidly straight, and his sunken eyes burned with a feverish, unnatural absolute darkness. Robert kept his hand resting cautiously near his leather holster, desperately pleading with Julian to explain the wire transfers. He offered to protect the boy, assuming Julian had been violently coerced or blackmailed by the Falcone family. But Julian merely tilted his head and laughed. It was a hollow, terrifying, metallic sound that echoed against the damp concrete walls and sent a shiver down the spine of the veteran cop. Julian raised his scarred, trembling hands, pushing them into the dim light for the captain to see. He spat out a twisted, venomous manifesto, declaring that the law Robert blindly served was a pathetic illusion designed to keep the weak in chains, and that true power only belonged to those willing to bathe in blood. Robert realized with absolute horror that the young man was completely gone, entirely consumed by a psychopathic desire for vengeance. The captain drew his weapon, his voice booming with authority as he commanded Julian to get on the ground. But Robert hesitated for a fraction of a second, his heart still seeing the innocent boy who used to play beautiful music in his living room. That single moment of profound mercy was a fatal mistake. From the blind spot behind a rusted shipping container, a Falcone hitman hired specifically by Julian stepped forward silently. The assassin swung a heavy iron pipe directly into the back of the knees of the police captain. Robert collapsed with a sharp groan of profound agony, his gun clattering across the dirty floorboards. Julian slowly walked over, his ruined lips curling into a grotesque smile as he picked up the discarded weapon with his mangled fingers. He looked down at the bleeding, helpless father of the woman he claimed to love with absolutely zero remorse in his dead eyes. Julian did not just want Robert dead. He desperately needed this murder to serve a master purpose. He pulled a distinct, heavy silver lighter from his coat pocket, an expensive item custom engraved with the Russo family crest that he had purchased at a premium on the black market. He tossed it onto the concrete near the fallen police captain. Then, Julian pointed the weapon directly at the chest of the older man. Robert looked up, fierce defiance shining in his eyes even as death loomed over him, silently praying for the ultimate safety of his daughter. Julian pulled the heavy trigger 3 times in rapid succession. The brutal execution echoed like thunder across the empty harbor. By nightfall, the horrifying news shattered the fragile, quiet peace of the safe house. Dominic was sitting on the edge of the canvas sofa, watching Clara prepare a fresh bandage for his ribs, when his encrypted burner phone vibrated aggressively. As he listened to the panicked voice of his underboss on the other end of the line, all the color drained entirely from his handsome face. He ended the call slowly and looked at Clara, a profound, heavy silence filling the small, claustrophobic room. When Dominic finally spoke the words, telling her that her father had been found murdered in an abandoned warehouse, the entire universe stopped spinning for Clara. The metal medical shears slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the floorboards with a dull, echoing clang. She could not breathe. She could not form a single rational thought. But then, Dominic delivered the final, devastating piece of the police report. The authorities had found a silver Russo lighter placed deliberately at the bloody scene, and the execution style matched the exact, brutal signature of Mafia retribution. The air in the room turned to absolute ice. The delicate, beautiful understanding Clara had built for Dominic only hours ago disintegrated into a million irreparable pieces. She looked at the man sitting before her, the man who had sworn on his life and the blood of his family that her father was completely safe. The vulnerable, broken boy she had seen last night banished entirely from her vision, instantly replaced by the terrifying, manipulative monster who had kidnapped her and ruined her life. She backed away from him, her slender body trembling with a violent, consuming mixture of profound grief and pure, unadulterated rage. Dominic tried to stand up, ignoring his bleeding wound, his hand reaching out to comfort her. His voice was unusually frantic as he swore to her that he had absolutely nothing to do with the murder, that he was being framed. But Clara could not hear his desperate pleas. The imaginary blood of her beloved father was screaming in her ears. The temporary illusion of humanity he had shown her felt like the most cruel, sick lie he had ever spun. The glowing embers of their newfound empathy were violently extinguished, replaced by a blinding, roaring fire of absolute hatred. She was trapped in a tiny room with the devil himself, and this time, her broken heart possessed absolutely no mercy. The transition back to the Russo estate was a suffocating blur of heavily armored convoys and impenetrable security perimeters. With the Falcone threat fully active and the tragic murder of Captain Robert Hayes making front-page news across Chicago, Dominic could no longer risk keeping Clara in the vulnerable safe house. They returned to the massive stone fortress, but to Clara, the sprawling mansion was no longer just a gilded cage. It had become a terrifying tomb. She locked herself inside the master suite for 3 consecutive days, drowning in a profound, agonizing sea of grief. The police reports haunted her every waking second. The execution style, the 3 bullets, the silver Russo lighter perfectly placed next to the body of her father. In her shattered mind, the brief moment of humanity she had witnessed in Dominic was nothing more than a sick, manipulative illusion designed to lower her defenses. On the 4th night, a torrential thunderstorm descended upon the city, mirroring the violent chaos tearing apart her soul. Clara stood perfectly still by the bedroom door, listening to the rhythmic, heavy footsteps of the security detail assigned to guard her. Her grief had mutated into a cold, hyper-focused rage. She was the daughter of a veteran police captain, raised to understand the brutal realities of the world, and she would not allow the murderer of her father to sleep peacefully under the same roof. Opportunity presented itself just after midnight. A young, exhausted guard standing post near the grand staircase momentarily unclipped his heavy tactical belt to adjust his radio earpiece. Moving with the silent, desperate grace of a phantom, Clara slipped out of the shadows. Before the man could even register her presence, she snatched the loaded Glock from his holster, stepping back and leveling the weapon at his chest with terrifying precision. The guard froze, his hands raising instantly, terrified of harming the untouchable wife of the boss. Clara did not say a single word. She simply backed away into the dark corridor, her eyes locked on the heavy oak double doors of the private study where she knew Dominic spent his sleepless nights. The study was cloaked in heavy shadows, illuminated only by the flashes of lightning outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and the faint glow of a desk lamp. Dominic sat behind his expansive mahogany desk, his injured torso tightly wrapped in fresh bandages, surrounded by scattered crime scene photographs and classified police files. He was frantically utilizing his vast underground network to track the origin of the silver lighter. The heavy doors crashed open. Dominic looked up instantly, his dark eyes widening in genuine shock. Clara stood in the doorway, her white nightgown billowing slightly in the draft. Her face was pale, tear-stained, and completely devoid of any fear. She held the stolen handgun with both hands, the black muzzle pointed directly at the center of his chest. Her hands were shaking, but her finger was curled securely around the trigger. "You killed him," Clara whispered, her voice of fragile, broken sound that carried the weight of 1,000 shattered worlds. "You promised me you was safe. You swore on your life, and then you ordered your men to execute him like an animal in the street." The personal guards of Dominic rushed into the hallway behind her, drawing their weapons and shouting desperate commands for her to drop the gun. "Stand down," Dominic roared, his voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. "Get out and close the doors. Leave us." The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second before retreating, pulling the heavy door shut and leaving the mafia boss entirely alone with his armed, devastated wife. Dominic slowly pushed his chair back. He did not reach for his own weapon hidden in the desk drawer. He did not attempt to disarm her with his superior speed and strength, as he had done during that terrifying first encounter in her living room. Instead, he stood up, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated his gunshot wound, and walked slowly around the desk. "Stay back," Clara warned, her breathing turning rapid and shallow, her grip tightening on the heavy weapon. "I swear I will shoot you." Dominic ignored the warning. He closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps until he was standing mere inches away from her. He looked down into her tear-filled, furious eyes, and then he did something that completely defied every survival instinct he possessed. He reached out, gently wrapping his large hand over her trembling fingers, and physically pulled the barrel of the gun until it was pressed firmly against the left side of his own chest, directly over his beating heart. "If my death is the only thing that will make you believe me," Dominic said softly, his voice a raw, bleeding confession in the dark room, "then pull the trigger, Clara." Clara gasped, her eyes searching his face frantically. She expected to see the arrogant, mocking smirk of a master manipulator. She expected to see fear, or hesitation, or the subtle guilt of a murderer backed into a corner. But as her keen nurse instincts kicked in, she read the involuntary physiological responses of the man standing before her. His pupils were perfectly steady, entirely devoid of the erratic dilation that accompanied dissection. His pulse, beating steadily against the cold steel of the gun barrel, was calm and unhurried. The dark eyes looking back at her contained absolutely no malice, only a profound, devastating sorrow and an unconditional surrender. He was telling the complete, undeniable truth. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The absolute certainty she had carried into the room shattered instantly. If Dominic had not killed her father, then the real murderer was still out there, hiding in the shadows, orchestrating a brilliant, bloody frame job to destroy the Russo empire from the inside out. A strangled sob tore from her throat. The heavy handgun slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the thick Persian rug with a muffled thud. Clara collapsed forward, her legs giving out completely. Dominic caught her instantly, his strong arms wrapping securely around her trembling frame, ignoring the burning pain in his ribs as he held her tightly against his chest. "I will find who did this," Dominic whispered fiercely into her dark hair, his voice vibrating with a lethal, terrifying promise. "I will tear this entire city apart brick by brick. But I need you to trust me." Clara buried her face in his shoulder, her tears soaking his shirt. She had absolutely nothing left in the world but the man she had been forced to marry. Through the agonizing pain of her loss, a new, dark resolve began to solidify within her. She pulled back slightly, looking up into the eyes of the underworld king, her expression hardening into a mirror of his own ruthless determination. They would call a truce. They would combine his terrifying power with her sharp intellect to hunt down the true monster who had destroyed her family. The captive and the captor were finally united, bound together by a shared, unquenchable thirst for absolute vengeance. The private study of Dominic Russo transformed from a sanctuary of crime into a frantic war room. The fragile truce between the mafia boss and his captive wife had solidified into a dangerous, highly efficient partnership. For 72 hours, they barely slept. Dominic unleashed the full, terrifying power of his underground intelligence network. His enforcers scoured the darkest corners of Chicago, shaking down informants, threatening black market dealers, and tearing through the ranks of the Falcone syndicate. Clara sat beside him at the massive mahogany desk, her eyes bloodshot but burning with a fierce, unwavering focus. She was no longer just a grieving daughter or a terrified nurse. She channeled the decades of police procedural knowledge she had absorbed from her father. When the men of Dominic brought back chaotic, fragmented reports from the streets, Clara meticulously organized the data. She cross-referenced the serial numbers on the shell casings found at the warehouse. She demanded the financial records of the corrupt Russo technician who had leaked the security protocols. The breakthrough came on the morning of the fourth day. A terrified fence from the Diamond District was dragged into the study. Bleeding and shaking, the man confessed to selling the custom silver Russo lighter just 2 days before the murder of Captain Hayes. When Dominic pressed a heavy blade against the throat of the dealer, demanding a name, the man sobbed that he did not know the true identity of the buyer. He only had a physical description. The buyer was a young man with a gaunt face, a feverish stare, and hands that were horribly mangled, covered in thick surgical scars and moving with a violent, unnatural tremor. The heavy silver pen in the hand of Clara dropped onto the desk, the sharp clatter shattering the silence of the room. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her as pale as a ghost. She looked at Dominic, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. "It was Julian," Clara whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of absolute disbelief and profound horror. "The anonymous medical grant you gave him. The massive wire transfer to the traitor in your security team. The ambush. The murder. It was all him." The horrifying truth settled heavily over the room. The gentle, aspiring violinist Clara had loved was completely gone. In his place, forged in the fires of pain and toxic vengeance, was a ruthless psychopath. Julian had not just betrayed her. He had brutally executed the man who had treated him like a son, all to orchestrate a perfect frame job meant to destroy Dominic and mentally break Clara. A lethal, terrifying darkness clouded the eyes of Dominic. He had underestimated the capacity for evil inside a broken, desperate man. He reached for his encrypted phone, ready to order a massive, citywide manhunt to drag Julian out of the shadows. Before his fingers could even dial the secure number, the personal cell phone of Clara buzzed aggressively on the desk. The caller ID was completely blocked. A sickening dread coiled tightly in her stomach as she slowly picked up the device. A video message appeared on the glowing screen. With trembling hands, she tapped play. The video did not show the face of Julian at first. The camera panned across a dark, filthy industrial space, illuminated only by harsh, portable work lights. The horrifying image focused on a group of 5 terrified, crying children huddled together on the cold concrete floor. They were wearing familiar pale blue hospital gowns. Clara felt her heart stop entirely. They were pediatric patients from her old ward at Chicago General Hospital, children she had personally cared for and comforted during her night shifts. The camera jerked back, revealing Julian standing in the center of the abandoned warehouse. He looked like a living nightmare. His face was hollow, his hair unkempt, and his eyes burned with a manic, unhinged glee. In his scarred, twisted right hand, he held a heavy electronic detonator with a blinking red light. The entire perimeter of the room behind the weeping children was lined with military-grade explosive charges. "Hello, my beautiful Clara," Julian said to the camera, his voice a sickening, mocking sing-song that made her skin crawl. "I thought about sending you a letter, but I know how much you care about your little patients. They miss their favorite nurse. And I miss my bride." Dominic stepped behind Clara, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter as he watched the glowing screen. "The false king took everything from me," Julian continued, his tone dropping into a venomous, hateful snarl as he stared directly into the lens. "Now it is time to balance the scales. I am at the old rail yard warehouse on the desolate edge of the city limits. You have exactly 1 hour to get here, Clara. Come completely alone. If I see a single Russo vehicle, if I spot one of his pathetic guards, or if you are even 1 minute late, I will press this button and turn these innocent children into ash. Your life for theirs. It is a simple trade. Show me that your precious morality is not just a lie." The screen faded to black, leaving only a deafening, heavy silence in the study. Clara stared at the dark reflection of her own terrified face on the phone. The monster Julian had become had perfectly weaponized her greatest vulnerability. He knew her soul. He knew she would never allow innocent children to die in her place. She slowly stood up from the desk, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, tragic resolve. She knew she was walking into a lethal trap, a twisted game designed by a madman, but she had absolutely no other choice. "You are not going alone," Dominic stated flatly, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as he moved to block the doorway. "I will tear that warehouse apart before he can even blink." "If you come, they die," Clara replied, her voice breaking but filled with an unwavering, desperate conviction. "He is completely insane, Dominic. He will kill them just to punish me. I have to do this." She looked up into the dark eyes of the mafia boss, the man she had once hated, who was now desperately trying to protect her from the ghost of her past. Clara reached up, her small hands resting gently against his chest, right over his beating heart. It was a silent, heartbreaking goodbye. Then she turned and walked out of the door, stepping willingly into the jaws of a madman to pay the ultimate price for the sins of the underworld. The blinding flash of orange fire tore through the cold Chicago night, as the desperate, manic screams of Julian were instantly swallowed by the deafening roar of the explosives. Dominic did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. Discarding every ounce of his pride and power, the underworld king lunged forward. He wrapped his massive, heavily scarred arms entirely around Clara, forcing her to the concrete floor and covering her fragile body completely with his own. The shockwave hit them like a devastating freight train. Concrete shattered, heavy steel beams twisted in the blazing inferno, and the warehouse collapsed in a catastrophic rain of fire and ruin. Julian, completely consumed by the toxic hatred he had allowed to fester in his broken soul, vanished forever into the blazing abyss of his own making. 3 agonizing months passed. The sterile, quiet air of the intensive care unit was broken only by the rhythmic, steady beeping of a life support monitor. Clara sat rigidly in a chair beside the hospital bed, her fingers intertwined tightly with the pale, motionless hand of Dominic. He had absorbed the absolute worst of the explosive blast to protect her. The surgeons had operated for 24 straight hours to remove the deadly shrapnel from his back, warning Clara that the mafia boss might never wake up. But she never left his side. The terrifying golden cage that once held her captive had burned to the ground, and she remained there entirely by her own free will. Slowly, the thick eyelashes of the fallen king fluttered. Clara held her breath, her heart pounding violently in her chest as those familiar dark eyes finally opened. He looked at her, his gaze completely stripped of the arrogant, terrifying dominance that had once defined him. There was only a profound, quiet peace in his expression. His voice was a raw, raspy whisper as he told her that the nightmare was finally over. While he was trapped in the coma, his most trusted lawyers had executed his ultimate command. He had voluntarily surrendered half of his vast, untouchable empire and a mountain of classified criminal evidence to the federal authorities, dismantling the most dangerous syndicates in the city from the inside out. He had washed the blood from his hands forever. Dominic Russo, the terrifying ruler of the underworld, was dead. He squeezed her hand weakly, promising to spend the rest of his breathing days as an ordinary man, striving every single moment to be worthy of the beautiful, unwavering light that had saved his corrupted soul. Clara leaned down, pressing her warm tears against his cheek, finally finding her true, peaceful home in the protective arms of a redeemed monster. Dear listeners, the dramatic journey of Clara and Dominic brings us a profound message about the deep complexities of human nature. This story teaches us that true love is never about forceful possession or toxic control, but about the absolute willingness to sacrifice everything to protect the person you cherish. We learn that holding on to dark vengeance can transform the most gentle, innocent soul into a terrifying demon, while profound empathy, patience, and forgiveness possess the miraculous power to rescue a lost spirit from the deepest darkness. there is always a fragile spark of humanity hiding within, waiting to be awakened by a kind and understanding heart. If you found yourself deeply moved by this emotional story, please remember to click the subscribe button, like, and share this video to listen to many more captivating stories every single day. How did this dramatic tale make you feel? Do you see any reflections of these intense emotional struggles, forgiveness, and redemption in our real life? Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and feelings from the very bottom of your heart, as we always want to listen to your unique perspectives. We want to wish everyone watching this video robust health, a joyful life, and peaceful days filled with happiness. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in the next video.